Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Apostate of Mind. I'm Mark Peralta, and with me, as always, is the lovely Apostate Anne. What's up?
Hey, everyone. So lately, I've had this topic on my mind, and that's the whole story of Genesis and the story about how a woman comes from man's rib. And especially with the Barbie movie coming out, really highlighting the patriarchal system. And then recently I came across this meme and it really speaks to this story. So the meme says, "Woman does not emerge from man's ribs, not ever. It's he who emerges from her womb. One of the greatest lies of patriarchy is framing the father as the life giver." So I realized that's true, that the idea that, men are superior to women is this origin story that God created man first and then out of his rib created woman. And so I wanted to dig deep into that story and ask you, is that a proper interpretation of this story? What does this story mean? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so in Genesis 2, as you recall, in our previous episode, we talked about Genesis 1 and 2 in the subject of the documentary hypotheses, and we talked about how there are two creation accounts. And so on this second creation account, unlike the first one, where God clearly makes man and women sort of like everything just is done at the same time, let there be light, and it's done. In this account, he starts off with Adam and then makes Eve from one of Adam's parts. So why don't we, can you read it?
Yeah.
Okay. And then we'll get into what are some of the most common interpretations of this text.
Sounds good. "But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. The man said, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man.'"
That's right.
So you mentioned multiple interpretations. What are some of the most common perspectives or interpretations of this verse?
Yeah. So the very first, the most obvious one would be a literal interpretation of it. And if you read it, it does sound like God's performing surgery.
Yeah.
Does it not?
It definitely does. And I've heard creationists believe that this is truly fact, literal rib creating a woman out of Adam's rib.
That's correct. And if you read up on answers in Genesis, they'll get into that and they'll say that literally this is what happened. So there's that perspective.
So what are the problems with that perspective?
Yeah. So one of the problems are that in Genesis 1 and 2, not everything that's being said there is meant to be used or interpreted literally. So why are we all of a sudden making that to be this literal thing? And from a biological perspective, like how would that have made any sense in antiquity? Like if you were to ask someone in the first century or, even prior, how do you make any sense of that? Like cutting someone's rib does not really yield to anything.
Right.
You can make stew out of it.
Now that we have evidence supporting the theory of evolution, we understand that it wasn't like humans were just created all of a sudden, but rather we evolved from other species over time. And so that's another point why this can't be taken literally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or how evidence is contrary to taking it literally.
That's right.
Especially now that we understand how genetics works and sex works, and you're thinking about, the chromosomes of the male bone and the DNA, how could it biologically create a woman? It doesn't scientifically make sense.
It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make literary sense either, because there seems to be a lot of debate as to what the word means. That word tselah in the Hebrew, that's often translated as rib. It also gets translated as side.
Okay.
So it's maybe that God made Eve from the side of Adam.
So if it means side, what is that portraying?
So I think what's in view there, and that's what Professor Christine Hayes teaches in her course on YouTube about biblical interpretation. When she gets into that, is that basically what the author had in mind here is that Yahweh picked up, a lump of clay, which if you read earlier, it does say that he makes Adam out of the earth. Clay, and then that clay, he's molding Adam into shape. And then from its side, he just pinched, like how you would pinch off, more of that clay in order to make something else.
Mm-hmm.
So a very primitive pinching of the side of Adam is what perhaps the author had in mind.
Okay.
So now we have more of a figurative interpretation of it versus a literal interpretation. Another perspective that I think it's really interesting is this one will come from the rabbis, because the rabbis are thinking if Adam was made first and Adam was made perfectly because Yahweh makes everything perfect, or at least the text says that it was very good, then how is that possible if Adam doesn't have the ability to reproduce, right? Because then reproduction really is at the essence of this question here. It's sort of like the chicken and the egg, which came first,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we all know that everyone needs a mom to be born, but we're not going to make woman the first one in creation. We're going to make man the first one in creation.
That's right.
And so then how do we explain that? So what these rabbis are suggesting, and this is in the Humash, which I think includes the Rashi, a widely accepted rabbinical commentary on the text. It says that Adam was androgynous, that he had both sexes, perhaps. And so what's being pinched off him is that sort of that feminine side that becomes the female sex.
And I've even heard people trying to make sense of it scientifically and be like, well, if man is XY chromosome, he pinched off the X chromosome and made a woman. But it doesn't work like that. It's chromosomes are a DNA expression. That doesn't apply there.
Yeah. So then there's another perspective that I find very interesting that also comes from another rabbinical source. This is from the Jewish Publication Society, and they're actually attributing this myth or this story to maybe more ancient narratives, other myths from antiquity. Here's what the commentator says. He says, the correspondence between the part of the body and the role of the one identified with it is found in both Mesopotamian and Greek literatures. So what he's saying is that the significance is not about how God created or like how that came to be, but rather what part of the body did God use to make Eve from, and what that symbolizes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not that the sense of that story was like, there's something about ribs that seems to be generating human beings. We just don't know how, but maybe that's how it all started. No, this is more like, what about the side of Adam that characterizes the identity of this being that's being made? And so they cite examples from other mythologies that are even more ancient than Genesis, where this takes place, not with regards to the creation of human beings, but interestingly so, with regards to the creation of other gods. So it says in the former, Ea, who's a Sumerian or an Akkadian god, the god of wisdom, is described as, and I quote, the ear of the god Ninurta, because Ea was made from the ear of the god Ninurta. And the god Ninurta was a god characterized by wisdom. And so this new god being made using the ear of Ninurta, I characterizes him as one who is very wise and pays attention.
Listens.
And follows orders.
Mm-hmm.
So in this context, the same principles are being applied to Eve, the first woman. And so what would that be?
So there's precedence of gods being created out of body parts of other gods, and that being a symbolism for representing that god.
That's correct.
Gotcha.
He then cites here, in Greek mythology, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, sprang from the forehead of Zeus, the seed of the brain, and Aphrodite, goddess of love, generation, and fertility, is said to have sprung from the foam in the sea that collected about the severed male organ of the god Uranus.
Interesting.
Yeah. So what I think is happening here is that the authors of this text are sort of borrowing from these ancient mythological concepts of how some gods came to be and how their personalities are explained, and applies that same concept to the body part as the origin onto Eve to then characterize her personality as one who is a great helper, a support, a companion, a partner. And so it's sort of like using both sort of a literal, because the rib means something, but it's not about the rib. It's about what the rib symbolizes. And that was then what would characterize Eve.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And so are there any other myths outside of the Bible that use that idea of a rib symbolizing a god?
Yeah, there are other examples. So in Sumerian mythology, the goddess Ninti is indeed associated with being born of the rib.
And I looked into that story of NT, and there are a lot more similarities that tie it to the story of Genesis. And I just wanted to highlight those.
Yeah, let's talk about those.
So one, just a brief recap of the story. So they're in this garden, and Enki does something to upset the god, and the god punishes him by hurting Enki. And the god, in order to heal Enki, then creates 8 gods using Enki's body parts. And one of them, as you mentioned, was Ninti, who was made out of his rib. And the name Ninti actually means lady of the rib or lady of life. And so she also represented this idea of the life giver, which is so similar to the Eve story. So some of the similarities include that they're both in a peaceful heavenly garden where that's where the gods dwell. The second similarity is that I forgot to mention that the Enki character eats a forbidden fruit, and there's a mention of a tree of life growing there in the garden. And then also Enki has a partner, or like a council that counsels Enki to eat of the plants that lead to him being punished. And so that's similar to sort of like the snake tempting Eve to eat the apple.
So many similitudes, yeah.
Yes, in addition to, as we already mentioned, the rib.
And you know, like why the rib is significant in the personality of Enki is that in Sumerian culture, ribs were believed to be the source of life and vitality. So by being created from Enki's rib, Ninti was seen as possessing a special connection to a life force.
That's very symbolic and foreshadowing.
Yeah, well, I mean, what better context to apply onto the creation of the first woman ever? Yeah.
So you've mentioned all these different perspectives or interpretations. So what do you conclude is really going on here?
Yeah, the right interpretation should be not that this text is offering as a view of hierarchy or prescription for patriarchy, that one came first and then the other one. I definitely reject that literal interpretation of it, that the rib was something about the rib and all that, but rather just the meaning of it, the meaning of what does that body part really have to say about the identity of Eve, and how they're just borrowing those same literary tropes that perhaps explain the origins of other gods, but in this Genesis context where the concern of the authors is not the origin of gods, but rather the origin of man and everything else, is borrowing from that same understanding that the body part, that there's something mystical about that and supernatural, and they went with it. And that's what's there. It's
way more feasible to think of the woman being a god, since she's the only one who can bear life in real life.
That's right. Now we could understand a little better about that whole story about Adam and Eve, and you know what the text actually says. Well, there you have it, folks. I'm Mark Peralta.
I'm Apostate Ann.
And this has been another episode of Apostate of Mind.